Hey everyone, welcome to another installment of What I've Been Listening to for May of 2021. Each month I take 20 to 25 completely random albums that I haven't heard before and I listen to them, let you know my thoughts, and score each of them on a scale of 1 to 10. And this month was really interesting. It was a lot different from last month's. I feel like last month was for the most part just positive reviews, but this month was definitely a lot more mixed, kind of all over the place. So I have a lot of interesting stuff to share with you guys. But before we jump into it, let's just take a look at the list real quick so you know what we're going to be discussing. All right, let's jump into it. So we're going to start out with Slowdive's fourth studio album from 2017, a self-titled album, and this is their first release since 1995. And I've heard the first three Slowdive albums. I love Slowdive, but I never got around to checking out this album, and I heard so many great things about it. So was definitely curious. And I was pleasantly surprised. I really enjoyed this album. I'm always skeptical of return albums, especially when there's been, such a wide gap of time since the previous release, but I really thought that they did a great job of giving us a very solid batch of tracks that have that beautiful euphoric Slowdive sound, and that was exactly what I was hoping for with this album when I put it on. I really enjoyed the whole album, but I thought that the first half was really exceptional. I mean, from track 1 to 5, it was just one banger after another. And for me, the two standout tracks on here are Don't Know Why and Everyone Knows. I really love Rachel's beautiful vocals on these tracks, and the production on these two have a lot of moments that bring me back to Souvlaki, which was very pleasant. And in all honesty, this might be my second favorite Slowdive album now after Souvlaki. So, all in all, I was pleasantly surprised, and I thought this was a very strong return album. So, I think I'm going to give this one an 8.5. All right, next we have the debut studio album from Paul McCartney and the Wings from 1971 titled Wildlife. Paul McCartney has so many great solo albums under his belt under his own name and also with the Wings, and I had never heard the first Wings album, so I was curious what I would think of this. And I have to say, I was pretty disappointed with this album, surprisingly. The first side really didn't have any standout tracks to me. I thought Bip Bop was a nice, goofy sort of track, but other than that, I really didn't care for the other three tracks on side one. They all felt kind of repetitive and draggy to me and really didn't have a lot of unique stuff going on from a compositional standpoint. I will say that side two does redeem itself a little bit. There are a couple of tracks that I really liked on side two, like I Am Your Singer. I really like the mixing and combining of Paul and Linda's vocals together on that track. And I also really enjoy the last two tracks, Tomorrow and Dear Friend. Tomorrow is just really catchy. It has a great chord progression, and it definitely gives me some Beatles vibes. And then Dear Friend is a really pretty ballad to wrap up the album. And yeah, so while I liked a few of the tracks on here, I thought the majority of it was sort of underwhelming, and the mood was kind of all over the place and hard to define. And also, when you look at classic Wings albums like Band on the Run, I don't think that this one can really stand up to an album like that. So, just going in with high expectations based on these great albums like Band on the Run, I was a little disappointed. Not one of my favorite Wings albums. So I think I will give this one a 6. All right, next we have the self-titled debut studio album from singer-songwriter Judy Sill, released in 1971. This is one of only two albums that she will release in her lifetime. Unfortunately, she passed away at the young age of 35. And I have heard her name a lot over the past few years, but I've never listened to any of her work, so I was very curious to see what I would think. And I gotta say, I loved this album. I loved the great guitar work, the beautiful vocal melodies, the amazing lyrics, and the wide range of instruments that are utilized throughout the album in very tasteful ways, particularly with the string arrangements. I think the strings add a whole nother layer of depth to the songs that they're being utilized in. The album is mostly acoustic guitar-based tracks, but she throws in a couple of piano tracks as well, and I think that gives the album some really nice contrast, and to me it's almost like a combination of Joni Mitchell and Carole King, stylistically. My favorite track on here is probably Lady O. I really love the vocal melody. It has an amazing chord progression, and those beautiful string arrangements underneath it just add such a layer of depth and emotion to the song. So I really enjoyed this album, and I definitely plan on checking out her second album as well. And it's really a shame that she passed away so young, because if her debut album is this strong, then I can only imagine the types of things that she would have continued to produce if she had continued writing. So great album. I'm going to give this one a 9. Okay, next we have the fifth studio album by U2 from 1987 titled The Joshua Tree. And this is an example of one where I am definitely showing my musical ignorance in certain areas, if you can believe it. I've never heard this album, but I've heard about it my whole life. Unfortunately, I am one of those people who kind of just never took U2 seriously for whatever reason. I think they're an easy band to make fun of, probably because of the whole thing that happened with the what is it? You got like a phone or a laptop and it had this album that you couldn't get rid of. I think that kind of started this weird trend of people making fun of U2. So I kind of always wrote them off. But I've heard about this album for so long. I was like, I got to check this out. And so many people say that this is one of the best 80s albums of all time. So I figured, why not? I'll go in with an open mind. And a couple of interesting things that I didn't know about this album. I had no idea that Bryan Eno did some production on here. So that definitely gave me some excitement going into it, and kind of raised my expectations for the album. And I gotta say, I thought it was a very good album. I can totally see why some people would say this is one of the best 80s albums. I wouldn't agree with that, but that's more just me stylistically, the kind of stuff that I like to listen to. I wouldn't say that this is an album that I would listen to a lot, but for what it is, I thought it was very, very good. And it was one of those albums where, as I was going through the tracks, I knew probably 60 to 70% of this album where, like, a track would come on, I'd be like, oh, I know this track. I didn't know it was from this album. And actually the song Bullet the Blue Sky, I always, as a kid, I thought that was a song by POD. And then I realized that they actually covered it from U2, so that was a little fun discovery as well. I really enjoyed the utilization of the delay on the guitar parts. That's something that The Edge has always been famous for, and he does it really well. And I think combining that with Bryan Eno's production is just, they just go together so nicely and very tastefully. One thing I will say is that I did enjoy the first half of the album a lot more than the second. I feel like the first half was similar to what I was saying about Slow Dive, where like the first 5 tracks are just one great song after another. And the second half is good too, but I think the high point for me was definitely that first half. So, very good album. I'm glad I listened to it. Now I know what it's all about. My favorite track is probably actually the opening track, Where the Streets Have No Name. And like I said, stylistically, this isn't something that I would listen to very often, but for what it is, I think it's very good. So I think I am going to give this one an 8. All right, next we have the second studio album by Muse from 2001 titled Origin of Symmetry. Muse is a band that I've heard a lot of their tracks over the years, but I've never checked out a full album, and I was never really that curious about them, but a friend of mine recommended this album for this month, so I figured, why not? And unfortunately, I did have a hard time with this album, and this is a weird one because I really can't put my finger on what I don't like about it. Usually with albums I can pinpoint it, but something about Muse's sound just doesn't really engage me very much, and I'm not sure why that is. If you have similar experiences when you listen to them, let me know what you think it is, because it's kind of a mystery to me. Because from a compositional standpoint, it does have a lot of interesting stuff going on with the wide variety of instruments being used throughout the album, as well as all of the electronic elements. But for some reason, the majority of the songs on here just kind of bored me and didn't have a lot of standout moments that really caught my attention. There are a couple of tracks that I did like. The one that was really the standout for me was Citizen Erased. I really loved that song. I loved the guitar groove, and I especially loved the falsetto vocal parts that happen in the chorus. And another track that I didn't mind was Plug In Baby. But other than that, I honestly wasn't too crazy about this album. And I know there are plenty of people that will disagree with me on this one. I know Muse has a pretty loyal fan base. But I don't know, it's just not my cup of tea for whatever reason. Maybe I need to listen to it a few more times and see if anything clicks, but just wasn't crazy about it. So I think I'm going to give this one a 6. All right, next we have the second studio album by Department of Eagles titled In Ear Park from 2008. Department of Eagles is a group that is fronted by Daniel Rawson from Grizzly Bear, and I am a huge Grizzly Bear fan, and I've always heard about these albums and just never got around to checking them out, so I was very excited. And unsurprisingly, this album was amazing. To me, it basically gives you a handful of really beautiful tracks that sort of resemble early Grizzly Bear, and then it also has a few that sort of veer off into their own different sort of territories, but they all blend together very well. The production is absolutely amazing, the instrumentation is great, and I love the mixture of the wide range of different instruments that they're combining. along with the auxiliary percussion. It has this really interesting and beautiful fusion of all of these different sounds. And there's so much amazing guitar work on here as well, particularly the opening track. We hear Daniel really showcase some of his more classical style of guitar playing with those fast finger-picked arpeggios. I love the way the album comes in with that track. A couple of other noteworthy tracks for me are Around the Bay. Really love the guitar part on that one as well. I think the vocal part is very pretty, and I love those bell sounds that are on top of it. I'm not sure what they're using for that instrumentally, but I love the effect that it creates. I also really love Waves of Rye. That's probably my favorite track on here. Just an amazing, eerie chord progression. And I really love the ending track, Balmy Night. The way that they utilize the banjo in this song, that washy, kind of reverb-drenched banjo with those really dark arpeggios. It's just such a cool, unique way to utilize a banjo. So all in all, I thought this album was very, very good. I will give this one a 9. All right, next we have Curtis Mayfield's second studio album from 1971 titled Roots. I really love his debut album, the self-titled album, so I was curious how this would be as a follow-up, and I thought this was very good. I wouldn't say that I like it as much as his first album, but I do think that it is still very solid. The lyrics on here are incredible. I love the message, particularly on tracks like Keep On Keepin' On, We Got to Have Peace, and Beautiful Brother of Mine. The instrumentation is also great, and that's always been something that I've loved about Curtis Mayfield's music, because a lot of his tracks will have these amazing instrument arrangements that almost create this sort of dreamlike sound. Like the best example I can think of is the opening of the song Makings of You from his first album. Just the opening of that with the strings, and I believe there's a harp. It just creates this dreamy sort of sound that's just so magical, and this album delivers on that as well, which was great. My favorite tracks on here are Keep On Keepin' On and the ending track, Love to Keep You in My Mind. So great follow-up to his debut album, but like I said, I do think it is the tiniest little downgrade from his first album, so I think I will give this one an 8. Okay, next we have the fourth studio album by Genesis from 1972 titled Foxtrot. Genesis is a band that I've heard a lot of tracks of, but the only album that I've ever listened to was Selling England by the Pound, and I've always seen this album pop up, so I figured I would check this one out. And I thought this one was amazing, very solid. For a prog rock album, I thought this gives you everything that you want from a prog album. So we have 6 tracks, and I thought every track on here was great in its own way. My favorite is probably the opening track. It just brings the album in so great. I love the organs, I love the production, I love the instrumentation with the flute and the oboe being utilized. The first side, we have 4 tracks, and I thought every track was great. And then when we go to side 2, we have this little short, like minute and 40-second guitar instrumental called Horizons, and I thought that was a nice little breather to set up the final track, Supper's Ready, which is like a 23-minute blowout track, which, if you're a fan of prog rock, you definitely would enjoy something like that. So all in all, I thought it was great, and I forgot how much I like Peter Gabriel's voice as well. I think he's got an amazing, unique sounding voice. So I really enjoyed everything about this album. I'm going to give this one an 8.5. Okay, next we have the 5th studio album by Utopia from 1980 titled Deface the Music. And the idea behind this album was to pay tribute to the Beatles and make different songs that sound like the Beatles throughout different periods of their career, which is a very interesting idea. And I'm not always crazy about albums like this, like anything that's sort of meant to be a tribute album, but I thought that they did a really good job with what they were going for. The first half has songs that are more based off of the early period of the Beatles, the earlier poppier period, and then the second half goes into the more later psychedelic realm. And I think on both fronts, they really did an amazing job of capturing the vibe of both of those periods of the Beatles. Particularly with the opening song, I Just Want to Touch You. That just sounds like straight up an early Beatles song with a little hint of Utopia in there as well, which I appreciate. A couple other noteworthy tracks for me are track 5, Alone, and track 6, That's Not Right, as well as the ending track, Everybody Else Is Wrong, which is based off of Strawberry Fields Forever and I Am the Walrus. So I thought it was very good. Like I said, it's not typically an album that I would be really into and listen to a lot, but for what they were going for, I think they did an amazing job. I think I will give this a 7.5. All right, next we have the 2020 release by Venar titled In the Dead Dead Wood. This is songwriter Mike Venar, who was from the band Ocean Size, one of my all-time favorite progressive rock bands, and he is somebody that I have just been following for years and years and years. I am one of his cult followers that will just listen to anything that he does. He's one of my all-time favorite songwriters, and I hadn't gotten around to this album yet, so I needed to check this out. A couple of things about his songwriting that I like so much is his ability to write really groovy, odd meter stuff and put these, vocal melodies on top of it that just sound so natural, and they just flow so nicely and sound so effortless against these odd meters. He also has this ability to write just these amazing chord progressions and, a lot of chords that will really catch your ear, that kind of throw you off guard, but are really colorful and really beautiful. And I think, once again, he delivered on all of those fronts. Pretty much everything that he's put out has been good. I've never heard anything by him that I didn't like, and this album is no exception. I enjoyed every song on here. I really loved the production. I loved the contrast between some of the more mellow, ballady type tracks alongside some of the heavier, hard-hitting tracks, which is a contrast that he always pulls off very well. My favorite track on here is probably track 8, Fork in the Road. He also has this amazing ability to really let these songs build and build and build, and that last track, Fork in the Road, is like a prime example of that, and such a beautiful way to conclude the album. So if you've never heard of this guy, I would highly recommend checking him out. Like I said, he's one of my all-time favorite songwriters, and unfortunately is not very well known, so I would highly recommend checking out some of his stuff if you haven't before. But I'm going to give this one an 8.5. All right, next we have the second studio album by Nas from 1996 titled It Was Written. I had heard a handful of songs from this album before, and I loved all of them, so I figured I might as well check out the whole thing. And this is the follow-up to his classic debut album, Illmatic, so it's definitely a tough act to follow, but I thought he did an incredible job following up that album. I think this album was very, very good. From a production standpoint, this album is a little bit more polished than Illmatic. Illmatic had, I think, more of a raw, sort of down and dirty kind of sound to it, but I think both of them, in their own respects, sound very good, and I think what Nas did with this type of production was amazing. I pretty much loved every song on here. The rapping is amazing, as is always the case with Nas. I love the beats. I like the darkness. I feel like this is sort of a dark album for the majority of the time, and I like sort of that underlying darkness throughout the album. A couple of standout tracks for me are The Message, Street Dreams, I Gave You Power, If I Ruled the World, and my favorite track on here is probably Black Girl Lost. I just really love the hook. Just very beautiful, and it has a great beat and great rapping. But all in all, I think this album is very good, and I really don't think he could have came up with a better follow-up to Illmatic. So I'm going to give this one a 9. All right, next we have the fourth studio album by Patti Smith titled Wave from 1979. And this album was when they were going more into a mainstream sort of pop style. And the main reason I checked this one out was actually because it was produced by Todd Rundgren. So from a production standpoint, I was curious what it was going to sound like. And I gotta say, I was kind of disappointed with this album. When I started it, I had high hopes because I really did like the first two tracks, Frederick and Dancing Barefoot. Dancing Barefoot is the big hit from this album. But then after that, it really kind of just lost me. I think stylistically, it's kind of all over the place, and there are some interesting things going on within certain songs. But in the context of piecing it together into a full album, it feels very scattered and kind of all over the place, and I can't really pinpoint what sort of mood she's going for with this album. I also liked the final track, Wave, as well, but I feel like that one is actually the most out-of-place song on here because you have kind of this, array of different songs throughout the album, and then she ends the album on the most experimental track. And it almost sounds like something that could have been on her first album, much more within that vein. So it really kind of just created these conflicting feelings throughout the album. But those three tracks are really kind of the high points for me, and then the whole middle chunk just really didn't do much for me. So I think I will give this one a 5.5. Okay, next we have the second studio album by Helmet from 1992 titled Meantime. Helmet is another band that I've heard a couple of tracks from before, but I've never checked out a full album, and this one seemed to pop up as one of their best works. And I gotta say, this was another one. I had a little bit of trouble with this one. There were things that I liked about it, but there were also things that I didn't like at the same time. It does have some really great, hard-hitting, badass guitar and drum grooves, which I appreciate. And I like the singer. I like his intensity and his vibe. But I think the thing that was off-putting for me with this album is that a lot of the songs to me just sound really similar. And it was almost hard to differentiate one song from the next. Like I couldn't even tell like when one song was ending and one was beginning at a lot of points. And I think a big part of why that is because almost every song, if not every song on this album, is in the same key. And like they almost all of them start with like that really low power chord. So in terms of that, I would have liked a little bit more diversity stylistically. Within the songs. I mean, I think the main thing that differentiates a lot of these songs is just like, slight tempo variations and stuff like that. But in terms of that was kind of like my main critique of the album. Maybe some people like that. It almost can kind of create the illusion that the entire album is one like really long song. Because like I said, I really had a hard time, being able to tell if it was going from one track to the other or if it was just like another section to the track that I was listening to. So, that's my main critique, but like I said, there are some good moments on here as well. It's definitely not a bad album. I think I will give this one a 7. Okay, now we have the 11th studio album by the Isley Brothers from 1973, titled 3+3. I'm embarrassed to say this is the first album I'm hearing by the Isley Brothers. I've heard tracks, but never checked out any albums. And I gotta say, this album completely blew me away. I loved every single song on here, and I thought it had a great mix of, more groovy tracks and some of the slower ballads, like Don't Let Me Be Lonely Tonight and You Walk Your Way. And it also has an amazing cover of Summer Breeze, probably the best version of that song that I've ever heard. And I listened to this album a few times, and there was really no low point. I mean, every time a song would change, I would just be like, wow, just another incredible song. My two favorites on here are If You Were There and You Walk Your Way, both just incredible songs, but every single track on here was amazing. So here we go. We are going to get our first 10 of the day. So way to go, Isley Brothers. All right, next we have the debut studio album by Kate Bush from 1978 titled The Kick Inside. I've never heard anything by Kate Bush before, and she's another artist that I've heard about for years and years and years, so I figured got to check out some of her stuff. And an interesting little fact about this album when I was reading up on it, as you can see, production-wise, you have Andrew Powell as well as David Gilmour co-producing it. And apparently David Gilmour is a big part of the reason as to why Kate Bush was able to get a record contract, which is a little fun fact. And I had no idea what to expect with this album, and I really, really enjoyed it. This is some of the most unique music that I've heard in a long time. It's really hard to pinpoint what this sounds like because as I'm listening to it, I'm getting so many different hints of all of these different artists, and just stylistically, her voice, that like high falsetto voice definitely has almost sort of an operatic feel to it at certain times. And that style of singing is something that I wouldn't picture myself being into and kind of would find it off-putting. But on this album, I really didn't mind it at all. I really like her voice, and I like the types of ways that she utilizes it within these songs. Instrumentally, we have a ton of really unique instruments being utilized all throughout the album. And stylistically, it's very wide too. There's so many different styles that are covered throughout the album, but I think that they all fit together very well. My two favorite tracks on here are probably Strange Phenomena and The Man with the Child in His Eyes. In general, I think that probably the first third of this album is my favorite. I think there's not a bad track on there. And then towards the end with the last couple of tracks, to me, it does lose a little bit of momentum, and that's probably the low point of the album for me. But it starts out on such a strong note for probably 3/4 of the album. So I think I will give this one an 8.5. All right, next we have the 5th studio album by German electronic music group Tangerine Dream from 1974 titled Phaedra. And this album was a trip, to say the least. I really enjoyed this album. Lots of amazing stuff going on from a production standpoint and also instrumentally. The use of the sequencers, the Moog synthesizer, the other synthesizers being utilized, the organ, the mellotron, the electric piano, flute, guitar, bass. So much great stuff being packed into these 4 tracks. And this is definitely an album that you want to sit down and just close your eyes and listen to it with headphones and really just kind of sink into it. It's definitely not an album to put on as like background music or anything like that. It's a full blown experience, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm definitely going to be checking out more of their stuff after hearing this. So really amazing album. And as you can see here, the utilization of the sequencers on this album apparently had a great influence on that Berlin School genre. So I thought that was really cool as well. So amazing album. I'm going to give this one a 9. All right, for our movie soundtrack for this month, we are continuing with John Bryan, and we are going to do the soundtrack to I Love Huckabees from 2005. And once again, John Bryan just completely delivers with another beautiful movie soundtrack. I mean, really, everything that he's done so far that I've heard, I've absolutely loved. And one of the things that I really liked about this album that sort of differentiated itself from the previous couple John Bryan soundtracks that we talked about is this one features a nice little handful of songs that he's actually doing vocals on as well, which sort of just sounds like some John Bryan original stuff that could have been on his album Meaningless. So I was very pleasantly surprised to hear that. A couple of my favorites from the vocal part of this album are the tracks Knock Yourself Out, Over Our Heads, Get What It's About, and Didn't Think It Would Turn Out Bad. And John Bryan just has this ability to write these very catchy, vocal melodies with these beautiful chord progressions, and it's packaged in a way that's very digestible to just like a normal listener, like a normal pop listener. And I really think that's a hard formula to really get down. I think John Bryan is just a master of that. And then we also have just some amazing instrumentals as well with, once again, just great melodies. Probably my favorite instrumental on here is Later Monday, which we hear a couple of themes, melodic themes in that song that pop up throughout the album. So just once again, an amazing soundtrack from John Bryan. I'm going to give this one a 9. All right, next we have the 7th studio album by Laura Marling from 2020 titled Song for Our Daughter. I've never heard of Laura Marling, but a good friend of mine spoke very highly of her and recommended this album, so I checked it out, and I thought this was an amazing album. Very beautiful songwriting, great guitar work. The instrumentation in the first 4 tracks of the album sort of reminded me of Joni Mitchell's Court and Spark album, the way that you have the acoustic guitar mixed with the drums, and then you have that 5th track, Blow by Blow, which is more of a piano ballad, which breaks it up really nicely. I love the instrumentation throughout the album. The combination of the acoustic guitar with the string arrangements is very beautiful. I also love the double bass, the pedal steel guitar, the slide guitar, just so much interesting stuff going on, but none of it is overbearing. It's all done in a very tasteful manner. And I thought pretty much every song on here was very solid. My favorite track was probably track 2, Held Down. I particularly love the background vocals that are happening throughout that song. I think it's very euphoric, and I love like the reverb on it. It just creates such a beautiful sound. So all in all, I thought this was a great album. I'm going to give this one an 8.5. Okay, next we have an album from 1973 from guitarists Carlos Santana and John McLaughlin titled Love, Devotion, Surrender. This is an album that I've definitely heard of for years and years and years, but never checked it out. So I was very curious to see how Santana and McLaughlin's playing would complement each other, because I think they are both very different players, and I thought they went together really well. This was a very fun album, and this is like a group that I would have loved to have seen live. I think a live experience of this album would have been amazing. So you have 5 tracks on here. We have 2 John Coltrane tracks, A Love Supreme and Naima. And it's cool hearing Carlos Santana play Naima, because I'm not as used to hearing Santana play over these more harmonically adventurous songs. So it was cool hearing him in that context. And I think the way that they kind of, just go back and forth blowing over A Love Supreme, I think they complemented each other nicely. And then we have 2 original tracks by John McLaughlin, The Life Divine and Meditation. And on Meditation, he's actually playing piano. I didn't even know that John McLaughlin played piano, but he's an amazing piano player. And then we have a traditional track, Let Us Go Into the House of the Lord. So the whole album is very much like a spiritual sort of message behind it. And yeah, I thought it was a really good album. I enjoyed it. I thought their playing complemented each other nicely, and it was just fun getting to hear them play over stuff like this together. So I think I will give this one an 8. All right, next we have the second album from the duo Knower from 2011 titled Think Thoughts. Knower is a duo consisting of Louis Cole and Genevieve Artadi, both top tier musicians that I'm sure all of you know and love. And I thought this album was excellent. Basically, anytime I'm listening to Knower or something involving Louis Cole, the two things that I'm expecting or hoping for are, those really intense, hard-hitting, groovy tracks mixed with these just beautiful, lush, euphoric sections, and there is plenty of that on this album. It's got some incredible features as well, like Tim LaFay, John Escreet, Aya Toyoshima, David Binney, and Vikram, and I always love whenever they have a feature on, a Knower or a Louis Cole album, and then they take a solo, because usually they just go so outside and just really start going in some interesting territories, and I love that, and it's usually always over, like I said, this really badass, hard-hitting groove, so the contrast just creates such an intense experience, and like I said, the combination of that intensity mixed with the more mellow, beautiful, euphoric songs and sections just creates such a great album. My favorite track on here is probably That's Where You Are. Genevieve's vocals on that are just so beautiful, and I love the melody and the keyboards and synths that are used. Just such a beautiful song just to kind of zone out to and just really put yourself in a vibe. So this was a great album. I'm going to give this one an 8.5. Okay, next we have the 13th studio album by Aretha Franklin from 1968, titled Aretha Now. It's kind of amazing that in 1968 she had already released 13 albums. Really incredible. And this album, I thought it was good. I wouldn't say it was amazing. For me, the first two tracks are really kind of the high point of the album with Think and I Say a Little Prayer. I Say a Little Prayer is probably my all-time favorite Aretha Franklin song. Just so beautiful. And really unique too. I mean, theoretically, like the chord progressions, kind of the time signatures, a lot of interesting stuff going on musically. And I do like the remainder of the songs on the album, but I do think that the momentum kind of dies down a bit for me after those first two tracks. I do like the cover of You Send Me, the Sam Cooke song, and I really like the ending track, I Can't See Myself Leaving You. And like I said, the other tracks in between are good too, but not probably not reaching the highs that I feel like the album reaches on the first two tracks. So not a bad album, but not one of my favorites from Aretha Franklin. I'm sure plenty of people will disagree with this one, and that's totally fine. I can understand that. But I'm going to give this one a 7.5. All right, next we have the second studio album by Deftones from 1997 titled Around the Fur. Deftones is a band I haven't heard much of. I love the White Pony album, but that's the only thing that I've heard, and I know a lot of people speak highly of this album, so I checked it out, and I really loved this album a lot. Right from the beginning when it opens up with My Own Summer, it establishes kind of like this heavy vibe, but you have the more like singy sort of vocals over the opening part, and then like when that heavy groove comes in and he starts screaming, it just hits so hard, and I just love the way that it establishes the album. And then from that point on, it hits us with one great song after another. So many amazing things going on throughout the album. The guitar work is incredible. It's very badass and hard-hitting, and I love the vocalist Chino Moreno and the way that he utilizes these different types of singing, such as his regular singing voice, which I think is really cool and really unique sounding and very distinct to the Deftones sound, and then also the whispering and the screaming, just a lot of nice different dynamics that he utilizes throughout the songs. And I think Deftones does a really great job musically and vocally of being able to weave in and out of more mellow parts and then more heavy parts within the same song. I think every song has a really nice contrast, and nothing really sounds monotonous or repetitive at any point. There's always these fresh new sections that surprise me and catch me off guard, and I just love that when I'm listening to anybody. My favorite song on here, it's cliche, but I just love Be Quiet and Drive Far Away. Such an incredible song. And really every song on here I thoroughly enjoyed. I thought this was a very, very good album. I'm happy I checked this one out. So I'm going to give this one a 9. All right, next we're going to continue going through Swerve Driver's discography. Now we're up to the 4th studio album titled 99th Dream. Last month I did their 3rd release, Ejector Seat Reservation, and I gave that one a 7.5. The first 2 albums that they did, I gave both of those 10s. So they have been going pretty strong for a while, but the 3rd album I thought lost a little bit of the momentum, and I was curious where this one was going to go. And while I don't like this one as much as the first two releases as well, I did think it was a slight improvement from Ejector Seat Reservation. It seems like with the third and fourth album, there's a little bit of a shift from the sound that they had in the first two albums. I feel like the first two albums are heavier and a lot noisier, kind of just like what you would associate with a shoegaze album. And I think the third and fourth album kind of take a little bit of a detour from that, where it's a little more mellow, probably not as dark as their first two releases. And there's nothing wrong with that, because I think there are still a lot of great things within this style as well. I always loved the guitar work on Swerve Driver, and with all of these albums, we're still getting amazing guitar work. I love the vocal melodies that Adam Franklin comes up with, these really beautiful, catchy vocal melodies. So I think that within this vein of the Swerve Driver catalog, there's still so much great stuff going on. A couple of standout tracks to me on here are 99th Dream, Up From the Sea, and These Times. So like I said, it's a slight improvement to me from the previous album, which I gave a 7.5, so I think I'm going to give this one an 8. Okay, next we have the debut studio album by Katherine Wheel from 1992 titled Ferment. This is an album and a band that I've never checked out, but I've always seen them pop up on shoegaze album lists, so was very curious. And I gotta say, this album completely blew me away. I listened to it 3 times, and I have to say that every time I listened to it, I liked it more. So I think it is one of those albums I really had to digest it a bit and get the songs in my head. But after I did that, I really enjoy every single song on this album. I love the production. It sounds, just like an early 90s shoegaze album. And it's really amazing how many great albums were released within like that early 90s time frame in the shoegaze genre. I really enjoyed the vocals. I thought he had a really nice voice. The guitar work was very good. Loved the production. And like I said, every song on here I really enjoyed. My 2 favorites are Black Metallic and the opening track, Texture. Texture, I think, is the perfect song to open this album with, because when I put it on and that song just came in, it had my complete attention right off the bat. Like when those drums kick in, it just goes so hard, it's so intense, and it's just so engaging. So love this album. I'm glad I checked this one out, and this is going to be the second album of the day to get a 10. All right, and last but not least, we have the third studio album by the band Sparks from 1974 titled Kimono My House. I've never even heard of this group, but Sparks is a duo formed in 1967. It's 2 brothers, Ron and Russell Mael. I hope I'm saying their last name right, M-A-E-L. And they have quite the extensive discography and are actually still making music to this day. So I'm amazed that I've never even heard of them, especially after I listened to it, because this album really blew me away. I'm amazed at how much stuff is going on throughout the album. It's really hard to pinpoint stylistically what it is, because they're doing so much stuff. You have these progressive elements of it. You have some moments that almost remind me of the Beatles. You have some moments that are like very high energy and intense and aggressive, and it almost reminds me of like the group Cardiacs. So such an interesting fusion of all of these different things, where it's like Frank Zappa meets the Beatles meets Cardiacs. And musically, it's incredibly interesting. A lot of interesting harmonic territory all throughout. Really great vocals. The production is very psychedelic, which I like. And yeah, just all around a really great album. My favorite track is probably the opening, This Town Ain't Big Enough for the Both of Us. And yeah, very happy that somebody recommended this one to me. I think I am going to give this one a 9. All right, so that concludes this month's albums. Like I said, there's a little bit more negative reviews on this one than there was in the previous month, so I'm sure there will be plenty of disagreement with some of the things that I said. There might be a few hot takes in some people's eyes, so please let me know where you agree and where you disagree, and what you think I might be missing out on with any of these albums. If you think there are any albums that I would really enjoy based on the albums that I've scored really highly on here, please feel free to recommend them in the comments, and I will add them to my long list of albums to check out. And yeah, that is about it. Thanks for checking this out, and hopefully you have a couple of new albums to listen to. So thanks for watching, and I will see you guys next month. Take care.